When Samuel Hartwell offered his worthless daughter Constance to a penniless cowboy as a cruel joke, he thought he was delivering the ultimate insult to both unwanted burdens. But as Jacob Thorne gazed into the quiet eyes of his unexpected bride, he had no idea that this woman, dismissed by her own father as plain prairie, dirt carried within her heart the answer to every prayer he'd never dared to speak aloud. What happens when the greatest gift comes disguised as the cruelest punishment? Blood dripped from Jacob's knuckles onto the saloon floor as he stood over the man who'd called him worthless. The August heat of 1867 made the Wyoming Territory town of Dusty Creek feel like the inside of an oven, but Jacob's anger burned hotter than any summer sun. "You take that back about my mama," Jacob growled, shaking his injured hand. The drunk cowboy on the floor groaned and rolled over, his nose bent at an ugly angle. "Your mama was a saint, Jacob," said Pete the bartender, wiping down glasses with a dirty rag. "Don't let fools like him get under your skin." Jacob picked up his hat from where it had fallen during the fight. His shirt was torn, his vest dusty, and his boots needed new soles. He looked like exactly what he was, man with more pride than pennies, more dreams than sense. "I'm riding out to the Hartwell place," Jacob announced, straightening his shoulders. "Time I asked for what I want instead of waiting for it to come to me." Pete stopped wiping the glass. "You sure about that? Samuel Hartwell eats men like you for breakfast." "Maybe so," Jacob said, pulling coins from his pocket to pay for his whiskey. "But I won't know unless I try." The ride to the Hartwell ranch took 3 hours through rolling grassland that stretched to the horizon like a green ocean. Jacob's horse, a bay gelding named Copper, picked his way carefully around prairie dog holes while his rider practiced the speech he'd been thinking about for months. "Mr. Hartwell," Jacob said out loud, his voice carrying across the empty plains, "I know I'm not much to look at, but I love your daughter Margaret with all my heart." The words sounded weak even to his own ears. What could he offer a man like Samuel Hartwell? Jacob owned 40 acres of rough land up north, a cabin he'd built with his own hands, and 20 head of cattle that barely kept him fed through winter. Margaret Hartwell had been raised in a big house with servants and fine dresses. She deserved better than a cowboy's broken promises. But Jacob had seen something in her eyes when they danced at the church social last month. She'd laughed at his jokes and hadn't pulled away when he'd held her hand. That had to count for something. The Hartwell ranch appeared in the distance like a small city. The main house was 2 stories tall, with a wraparound porch and real glass windows. Barns and outbuildings dotted the landscape, and Jacob could see hundreds of cattle grazing in the distance. This was what success looked like in the Wyoming Territory land, livestock, and the respect that came with both. Jacob's stomach twisted as he rode up the long drive. 2 ranch hands stopped their work to stare at him, taking in his patched clothes and worn saddle. He could feel their judgment like weight on his shoulders. "You lost, mister?" called one of the hands, a big man with arms like tree trunks. "Come to see Mr. Hartwell," Jacob replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Got business with him." The ranch hand laughed. "What kind of business could you have with the boss?" Before Jacob could answer, the front door of the house opened. Margaret stepped onto the porch, her auburn hair catching the afternoon light like fire. She wore a blue dress that matched her eyes, and for a moment Jacob forgot how to breathe. "Jacob?" Margaret's voice carried surprise, and something else worry maybe. "What are you doing here?" "Come to talk to your father," Jacob said, dismounting from Copper. His legs felt unsteady, but he forced himself to walk toward the porch with confidence he didn't feel. "Papa's in his office," Margaret said quietly. "Jacob, maybe you should." "Margaret, who's that at the door?" Samuel Hartwell's voice boomed from inside the house. The man himself appeared a moment later, tall and broad-shouldered with silver hair and eyes like winter sky. He looked at Jacob the way a man might look at a bug on his dinner plate. "Papa, this is Jacob Thorne," Margaret said quickly. "I know who he is," Hartwell interrupted. "The question is, what's he doing on my property?" Jacob stepped forward, hat in hand. This was the moment that would decide his future. "Mr. Hartwell, I've come to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Margaret gasped. The ranch hands stopped pretending to work and stared openly. Even the chickens in the yard seemed to go quiet. Samuel Hartwell's face showed no emotion at all. He looked Jacob up and down, taking in every patch, every stain, every sign of a man who worked with his hands for wages that barely kept him alive. "Come inside," Hartwell said finally. "We need to talk." The inside of the Hartwell house was like stepping into another world. Jacob's boots echoed on polished wood floors as he followed Samuel Hartwell through rooms filled with furniture that probably cost more than Jacob made in a year. Paintings hung on the walls, real paintings, not the cheap prints most folks had. Everything smelled of money and power. Hartwell led him to an office lined with books and ledgers. The older man sat behind a massive desk made of dark wood that gleamed like still water. He didn't invite Jacob to sit. "So," Hartwell said, opening a leather-bound book and dipping his pen in ink, "you want to marry my daughter?" "Yes, sir," Jacob replied, his mouth dry as dust. "I know I don't have much, but—" "Stop right there!" Hartwell held up one hand without looking up from his writing. "Before you tell me what you don't have, why don't you tell me what you do have?" Jacob shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Well, I own 40 acres of good grazing land up north. Built a cabin there myself, nice and tight for winter. Got 20 head of cattle and a good horse." "Debt?" Hartwell asked, still writing. "No, sir. Everything I own is paid for." "Family?" "My parents died of fever when I was 16. Got no brothers or sisters." Hartwell finally looked up from his ledger. "So you're alone in the world with 40 acres and 20 cows. That's what you're offering for my daughter?" The words hit Jacob like physical blows. When Hartwell said it like that, it sounded even worse than Jacob had feared. "I know it's not much, but—" "It's nothing," Hartwell interrupted. "Less than nothing. Do you know what my daughter is worth? What dowry comes with a Hartwell bride?" Jacob felt heat rise in his cheeks. "She's worth everything to me, sir." "Everything to you is nothing to anyone else," Hartwell said with a cold smile. "My daughter will marry a man who can provide for her properly. A man with land, money, and a future. Not a saddle tramp who can barely keep himself fed." "I may not have much money," Jacob said, finding his voice, "but I work hard. I'd treat Margaret like a queen. I'd never raise a hand to her or speak harsh words. You'd what? Love her?" Hartwell laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Love doesn't pay bills, boy. Love doesn't buy food or clothes or medicine when the children get sick. Love is a luxury for people who don't have to worry about survival." Through the office window, Jacob could see Margaret hanging laundry on a line behind the house. She moved with grace that made his heart ache, her hair dancing in the breeze like something alive. Just watching her made him feel like he could move mountains. "I'd find a way to give her everything she needs," Jacob said quietly. "A man can do amazing things when he's got the right reason." "Can he now?" Hartwell leaned back in his chair, studying Jacob like a scientist, looking at a bug under a magnifying glass. "Tell me, boy, what makes you think you're worthy of any woman, let alone my daughter?" The question cut deep because Jacob had asked it of himself 1,000 times. What did make him worthy? He couldn't read fancy books or speak pretty words. He'd never been to school past the 6th grade. His clothes were mended and his hands were rough from work. But surely there was something. "I'm honest," Jacob said finally. "I keep my word. I work hard and I don't drink too much or gamble away my wages. I go to church when there's a preacher in town. I help my neighbors when they need it." "So does half the territory," Hartwell said. "That's not special, boy. That's just being a decent human being." Jacob felt his face burn with shame. Every word out of Hartwell's mouth was true. He was ordinary, nothing special, just another cowboy trying to make something of himself in a hard land. But then he thought of Margaret's laugh, the way she'd smiled at him during their dance, the soft pressure of her hand in his. That had to mean something. "Maybe I'm not special," Jacob said, his voice growing stronger. "But I love her, really love her. Not just her pretty face or her father's money. I love the way she hums when she thinks nobody's listening. I love how she's kind to the church ladies even when they're gossiping about folks. I love that she reads books and has opinions about things. I'd spend my whole life trying to make her happy. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes studying Jacob's face. Finally, he spoke. You know what? You've convinced me. Jacob's heart leaped. Sir? I'm going to give you one of my daughters in marriage. Thank you, sir. I promise you won't. But not Margaret. The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs, felt the world tilt sideways. Sir? My other daughter, Hartwell continued, his voice smooth as silk. Constance. She's 23, plain as prairie dirt, and so shy she can barely string 2 words together. Been trying to find her a husband for years, but no man wants damaged goods. Jacob's mind reeled. He'd forgotten that Margaret even had a sister. The girl was always in the background, quiet and forgettable, doing the cooking and cleaning while Margaret charmed visitors in the parlor. I don't understand, Jacob said weakly. It's simple arithmetic, Hartwell explained, clearly enjoying himself. You want a wife? I want Constance off my hands. She's getting too old to be useful, and I'm tired of feeding her. You can have her, along with a small dowry, to help you get started. Consider it charity for both of you. The cruelty of it took Jacob's breath away. This wasn't a marriage proposal being offered, it was disposal. One unwanted thing given to another unwanted thing. What if I say no? Jacob asked. Hartwell's smile was cold as winter wind. Then you ride out of here with nothing, just like you rode in. But if you say yes, you get a wife and enough money to improve that pitiful ranch of yours. Seems like a fair trade to me. Through the window, Jacob could see a woman in the kitchen garden, kneeling among the vegetables. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a faded dress that had seen better days. As he watched, she looked up at the house, and for just a moment, their eyes met through the glass. She looked away quickly, but not before Jacob saw something in her face that made his chest tighten. Not hope she was too smart for that, but a kind of resigned acceptance that cut him deeper than any insult. Well? Hartwell asked. What's it going to be, boy? Take what's offered, or ride away with nothing? Jacob's hand trembled as he reached for the glass of water Samuel Hartwell offered him, the crystal catching afternoon light like trapped fire. The older man's cruel proposal hung between them like smoke from a branding iron, burning everything it touched. I need time to think, Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. Time? Hartwell laughed, settling back into his leather chair. Boy, this isn't a business deal you negotiate. It's charity. Take it or leave it, but decide now. Through the office window, Jacob watched Constance working in the garden, her movements careful and quiet. She pulled weeds with the same attention most people gave to precious things, as if the vegetables were her only friends in the world. When a ranch hand walked past and said something that made her shrink back, Jacob felt anger flare in his chest. She seems like a good person, Jacob said carefully. Good? Hartwell snorted. She's useful, I'll give you that. Cooks better than most restaurant chefs. Keeps house like her life depends on it. Never talks back or causes trouble. But she's 23 and still unmarried, which tells you everything you need to know about her prospects. Jacob watched Constance stand and brush dirt from her skirt. Even from a distance, he could see the care she took with simple tasks, the way she treated everything around her with respect. It wasn't Margaret's bright beauty that caught the eye, but there was something else, a kind of quiet strength, that drew him despite himself. What's wrong with her? Jacob asked. Wrong? Hartwell seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. Nothing's wrong with her exactly. She's just ordinary. Plain face, quiet as a church mouse. No spark to catch a man's interest. Margaret's got that fire that makes men fight duels. Constance just exists. The words hit Jacob like stones. He thought of all the times people had called him ordinary, forgettable, not worth much attention. The feeling of being dismissed and overlooked was as familiar as his own heartbeat. Can I meet her properly? Jacob asked. Talk to her before I decide. Hartwell's eyebrows rose. You want to court damaged goods? Most men would just take the deal and be grateful. Most men aren't me, Jacob replied. surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. Fair enough. Hartwell stood and walked to the window. Constance, come inside, girl. Got someone wants to meet you. Jacob watched the young woman's face change from calm to worried in the space of a heartbeat. She looked toward the house like a rabbit that had spotted a hawk circling overhead. But she wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the porch with steady steps. Remember, Hartwell said quietly as footsteps approached the door, she's not Margaret. Don't expect sunshine and roses. Constance appeared in the doorway, her brown hair escaping from its pins in small wisps that caught the light up close. Jacob could see that Hartwell was wrong about her face being plain. It wasn't the kind of beauty that stopped traffic, but there was something appealing in the gentle curve of her mouth, the intelligence in her dark eyes. Constance, this is Jacob Thorne, Hartwell said. He's come calling. Her eyes widened, and Jacob saw a flash of something: surprise, hope, fear, before she quickly looked down at her hands. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Thorne. Her voice was soft but clear, with a musical quality that reminded Jacob of wind chimes. She didn't stutter or stumble over the words the way truly shy people did. She just spoke quietly, as if she'd learned that drawing attention usually brought trouble. Pleasure's mine, Miss Hartwell, Jacob replied, removing his hat. Your father says you keep the finest garden in the territory. A small smile touched her lips. It's nothing special, just vegetables and herbs mostly. Those tomatoes look better than anything I've managed to grow, Jacob said truthfully. Takes real skill to get them that size in this heat. The smile grew a little larger. The secret is watering them just after sunrise and before sunset, and singing to them sometimes. Singing? Jacob felt his own smile starting. Plants like music, Constance said, then blushed as if she'd revealed some embarrassing secret. I know it sounds foolish. Doesn't sound foolish to me. My horse likes it when I sing to him on long rides. Seems to calm him down. For the first time since entering the room, Constance looked directly at him. Her eyes were warm brown, like good coffee or rich soil, and Jacob found himself thinking that Hartwell was blind if he couldn't see the beauty there. What do you sing to your horse? She asked. Old songs my mama taught me. Church hymns mostly, but sometimes fiddle tunes when the mood strikes. I'd like to hear them sometime, Constance said, then immediately looked away as if the words had escaped without permission. Maybe you will, Jacob replied gently. Hartwell cleared his throat loudly. Well, now that you've met, what's your decision, Thorne? Jacob looked at Constance, who had gone very still. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and he could see the effort it took for her to keep her face calm. She expected rejection. She'd probably expected it so many times that hope had become too painful to risk. Miss Constance, Jacob said carefully, would you take a walk with me? I'd like to talk to you private, if that's all right. Her surprise was so complete that she forgot to hide it. You want to talk to me? Yes, ma'am. Very much. Hartwell frowned. There's no need for all this ceremony. Just say yes or no. The lady deserves a say in her own future, Jacob said firmly. This concerns her as much as anyone. The words seemed to hit Constance like a physical force. She stared at Jacob as if he'd just announced he could fly. When was the last time, Jacob wondered, that anyone had asked for her opinion about anything? Yes, she said finally. I'd like that. They walked out into the late afternoon sun, leaving Hartwell scowling behind his desk. The ranch yard was busy with the usual end-of-day activities, hands bringing in horses, cattle lowing in the distance, chickens pecking at scattered grain. But Jacob barely noticed any of it. All his attention was focused on the quiet woman walking beside him. Your father wants us to marry, Jacob said when they were out of earshot of the house. I know. Her voice was steady, but Jacob caught the slight tremor underneath. He told me this morning that he'd found someone willing to take me. The casual cruelty of those words made Jacob's jaw clench. Is that what you want? To be taken by someone? Constance stopped walking and turned to face him. For a moment, something fierce flickered in her eyes. What I want has never mattered much to anyone, Mr. Thorne. I'm 23 years old and my father considers me a burden. If you're willing to marry me, I'll try to be a good wife. That's about all I can promise. What if I told you that what you want matters to me? The question seemed to catch her completely off guard. She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he was mocking her. "I don't understand," she said finally. "It's simple. Do you want to marry me? Not because your father says you should, not because you think you have to, but because you want to." Tears gathered in her eyes, though she fought to keep them from falling. "Nobody's ever asked me that before. I'm asking now." She was quiet for so long that Jacob began to think he'd pushed too hard. Then she spoke, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze. "I don't know you well enough to love you, Mr. Thorne, but you're the first person in years to treat me like I might have thoughts worth hearing. If that's the kind of man you are, then yes, I'd be honored to be your wife." The wedding took place 3 days later in the Hartwell family parlor, with only a handful of witnesses and a traveling preacher who smelled like tobacco and cheap whiskey. Constance wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, the ivory silk making her skin glow like candlelight. Jacob had borrowed a clean shirt from one of the ranch hands and polished his boots until they almost looked new. He stood beside Constance at the makeshift altar, acutely aware of every eye in the room, some curious, some pitying, most just glad the awkward business was finally being settled. Margaret sat in the front row, wearing a blue dress that matched her eyes, her face a careful mask that couldn't quite hide her confusion and hurt. She kept glancing between Jacob and her sister, as if trying to solve a puzzle that made no sense. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, Jacob held his breath, but Margaret remained silent. "Do you, Jacob Thorne, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked, his words slightly slurred from whatever he'd been drinking. "I do," Jacob said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "And do you, Constance Hartwell, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Constance's "I do" was whispered so softly that only Jacob and the preacher heard it, but her hand was steady as she slipped the simple gold band onto her finger. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Jacob looked down at Constance, seeing his own nervousness reflected in her eyes. This was their first kiss, the seal on a bargain neither of them had truly chosen. But when their lips met, something unexpected happened, a spark of genuine warmth that surprised them both. The small gathering applauded politely, and Samuel Hartwell stepped forward with an envelope. "Your dowry," he said to Jacob, loud enough for everyone to hear. $200 to help you get started. More than generous for damaged goods." Jacob felt Constance flinch beside him at the cruel words, but he kept his expression neutral as he took the money. "Much obliged, Mr. Hartwell." "Don't thank me yet," Hartwell replied with a cold smile. "Wait until you've lived with her for a month or two. Then you'll understand what a favor I've done myself." The words hung in the air like a curse, and Jacob saw the light die in Constance's eyes. She'd been reminded, on her wedding day, exactly how little her own family valued her. "Well then," Jacob said, offering his arm to his new wife, "I guess we'd better head home and find out." The wagon ride to Jacob's ranch took 4 hours through rolling grassland that stretched to the horizon. Constance sat beside him on the wooden seat, her few belongings packed in a single trunk in the wagon bed. She hadn't said a word since leaving her father's house, just stared ahead at the endless prairie with the expression of someone going to her execution. "You all right?" Jacob asked when they stopped to rest the horses at a creek crossing. "Fine," she replied, but her voice was tight with held-back tears. "You don't have to pretend with me," Jacob said gently. "This is hard for both of us." That broke something loose inside her, and the tears she'd been fighting finally spilled over. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. "I know this isn't what you wanted. I know you came for Margaret." Jacob climbed down from the wagon and walked around to her side. "Can I tell you something?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Yesterday, when I was watching you in the garden, I saw something that made me think. You were pulling weeds, but you did it gentle, like careful not to hurt the good plants. Most people just yank everything up and sort it out later. But you took time to make sure you only took what needed taking." Constance looked confused. "It's just weeding." "No," Jacob said. "It's caring. It's paying attention to things that matter, even when nobody's watching. That tells me more about who you are than any pretty face ever could." She stared at him with wonder, as if he'd just told her she could fly. "You really see that?" "I see a lot of things your father missed," Jacob replied. "Give me time, and maybe I'll see even more." They reached Jacob's ranch just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The cabin sat in a small valley surrounded by rolling hills, modest but solid, with a stone chimney sending lazy smoke into the evening air. "It's not much," Jacob said as he helped Constance down from the wagon, "but it's built to last, and the creek never runs dry." Constance walked slowly around the cabin, taking in the neat garden plot, the well-built barn, the pasture where Jacob's cattle grazed peacefully. "You built all this yourself?" "Every board and stone," Jacob said with quiet pride. "Took 3 years, working mostly evenings and weekends when I wasn't hired out to other ranches." "It's beautiful," Constance said, and Jacob could hear the surprise in her voice. She'd expected a shack, he realized. Everyone probably had. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. One main room with a kitchen area, a bedroom, and a loft for storage. Jacob had cleaned everything until it sparkled, and some probably his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had left wildflowers on the table and fresh bread on the counter. "Mrs. Patterson must have stopped by," Jacob explained, seeing Constance notice the flowers. "She's good people. Lives about 2 miles east with her husband and 3 kids." "She knows about us?" Constance asked, her cheeks reddening. "Whole territory knows by now, I expect. News travels fast out here." Jacob set her trunk down by the bedroom door. "But don't worry about what folks think. Most of them are too busy with their own troubles to spend much time judging ours." Constance nodded, but Jacob could see the worry in her eyes. She was thinking about Margaret, about the man who'd wanted to marry someone else and gotten stuck with her instead. She was wondering how long his kindness would last before he started to resent the bargain he'd made. "I'll sleep in the loft," Jacob said quietly. "Give you time to get used to things. No pressure, no expectations. We'll figure this out as we go." The relief on her face was so complete that Jacob felt his heart break a little. What kind of life had she lived that simple decency seemed like a miracle? "Thank you," she whispered. That night, as Jacob lay on his makeshift bed in the loft, listening to the quiet sounds of Constance moving around below, he wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He'd married a woman he barely knew to spite a man who'd insulted them both. It wasn't the foundation for happiness most folks would choose. But when he closed his eyes, he didn't see Margaret's bright beauty or Samuel Hartwell's cruel smile. He saw Constance in the garden, gentle hands caring for growing things, and the wonder in her eyes when he told her that her thoughts mattered. Maybe, Jacob thought as sleep finally claimed him, there were worse ways to start a marriage than with kindness and hope. The crash of breaking dishes woke Jacob from a deep sleep, followed by Constance's sharp cry of pain. He tumbled down from the loft in his long underwear, heart racing, to find his wife standing in the kitchen surrounded by pieces of his mother's china plate, blood dripping from her finger onto the wooden floor. "I'm so sorry," Constance said, tears streaming down her face. "I was trying to make breakfast and I dropped it, and now it's ruined, and I know it must have been special, and—" "Hey, hey," Jacob said softly, crossing to her in 3 quick strides. "Let me see that finger." He took her hand gently, examining the cut. It was deep enough to need attention but not dangerous. What struck him was how she trembled at his touch, as if she expected him to strike her for the accident. "It's not bad," he said, wrapping her finger in a clean kitchen towel. "We'll get it cleaned up and bandaged, good as new." "But your plate," she whispered, looking at the broken pieces. "I've ruined it." Jacob glanced at the shattered china, the last piece of his mother's good dishes, kept safe through 3 moves and countless meals. For a moment, grief twisted in his chest. Then he looked at Constance's terrified face and realized something important. "It's just a plate," he said firmly. "You're hurt and upset over a piece of pottery that can't think or feel or love anyone back. That doesn't make sense." Constance stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. "You're not angry? About an accident?" "No, I'm not angry." Jacob guided her to a chair at the kitchen table. Sit down while I get some bandages from the medicine box. As he cleaned and wrapped her finger, Jacob noticed how carefully Constance watched his face, looking for signs of the rage she clearly expected. How many times, he wondered, had someone made her feel worthless over small mistakes? There, he said, tying off the bandage. Good as new. Now, what were you trying to make for breakfast? Pancakes, Constance said quietly. I wanted to make something nice for your first morning home. I know you must be disappointed about everything. Jacob poured coffee from the pot she'd managed to make before the accident and set a cup in front of her. What makes you think I'm disappointed? Because you wanted Margaret, Constance said simply. Everyone knows that. And instead you got stuck with me. The words hung between them like a wall, built from years of being told she wasn't worth much. Jacob sat down across from her, choosing his words carefully. You know what I learned yesterday watching you unpack your things, he said. You own 3 books of poetry, but you kept them hidden at the bottom of your trunk, like they were shameful secrets. You can read and write better than most men I know, but you act like it's something to be sorry for. Constance's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. Papa always said education was wasted on women. Said it just gave us ideas above our station. Your papa was wrong about a lot of things, Jacob said quietly, including you. They spent the morning working together to clean up the broken plate and make a proper breakfast. Jacob watched his wife move around the small kitchen with practiced ease, turning simple eggs and bacon into something that tasted like a feast. She hummed while she worked just like he'd noticed at her father's house, and the sound filled the cabin with warmth. You've got a pretty voice, Jacob said as they ate. Constance blushed. I don't really sing, just make noise sometimes. My mama used to say that humming was the soul talking when words weren't enough. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was, Jacob agreed. Would have liked you, I think. She always said you could tell everything you needed to know about a person by how they treated things that couldn't fight back. Like broken dishes? Constance asked with a small smile. Like broken dishes, Jacob confirmed. And scared horses, and wilted plants, and people who've been told they don't matter. After breakfast, Jacob showed Constance around the ranch property. His 20 head of cattle grazed in the main pasture, healthy and well-fed despite the dry summer. The vegetable garden behind the cabin was smaller than what she'd tended at her father's house, but Jacob had built it with careenite rows protected by a fence to keep out rabbits and deer. Feel free to change anything you want, Jacob said as they walked. Make it yours. Change things? Constance looked genuinely puzzled. But it's your ranch. It's our ranch now, Jacob corrected. Your home as much as mine. The idea seemed to overwhelm her. At the Hartwell ranch, she'd been a servant in her own family's house, expected to stay invisible and make no demands. The thought that she might have opinions worth considering about her own living space was clearly revolutionary. I wouldn't know where to start, she admitted. Start small, Jacob suggested. Maybe add some flowers to the garden. I noticed you like pretty things, even if you don't think you deserve them. That afternoon, while Jacob rode out to check on the cattle, Constance explored the cabin more thoroughly. She found books on the shelves, practical volumes about ranching and farming, but also a few novels and a collection of Robert Burns' poetry that showed signs of frequent reading. When Jacob returned at sunset, he found her sitting at the kitchen table with one of his books open in front of her, a look of concentration on her face that made her seem like a different person entirely. Finding anything interesting? He asked, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. You have Jane Eyre, she said, wonder in her voice. I've wanted to read this for years, but Papa said novels were foolish nonsense. Keep it as long as you want, Jacob said. I like that one too. Jane reminds me of someone I know, smart and strong, but told she's not worth much by people who should know better. Constance looked up at him with something new in her eyes, not just gratitude, but the beginning of hope. You really don't mind if I read your books? I'd be honored if you did. Maybe we could read to each other sometimes, like you did with the poetry at your father's house. You remember that? I remember everything about that day, Jacob said truthfully. Especially the way you looked when you thought nobody was watching, like there was a whole world inside your head that you weren't allowed to share. As they prepared dinner together, Jacob noticed how Constance moved with growing confidence around the kitchen. She seasoned the stew with herbs from memory, kneaded bread dough with the rhythm of long practice, and set the table with small touches that made everything look inviting. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Jacob asked as they sat down to eat. "Mama taught me before she died," Constance said. "Then I took over the kitchen when I was 14. Had to feed Papa and the ranch hands, so I learned to make a little go a long way." "You were running a household at 14? "Someone had to," she said simply. "Margaret was. Margaret, beautiful and charming and meant for better things than cooking and cleaning. I was the practical one." Jacob heard years of loneliness in those words, the weight of a girl forced to grow up too fast while her sister was pampered and protected. No wonder Constance seemed older than her 23 years she'd been carrying adult responsibilities since childhood. "That's a heavy load for anyone, especially a kid," he said. "I didn't mind," Constance replied automatically, then paused. "Well, I did mind sometimes, but minding didn't change anything." That night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Jacob watched his wife read by lamplight. Her face was peaceful in a way he hadn't seen before, as if books were the one place where she felt truly safe. When she looked up and caught him watching, she blushed and started to close the volume. "Don't stop on my account," Jacob said. "I like watching you read. You get this look on your face, like you're somewhere far away and wonderful." "I've always loved stories," she admitted. "They're like windows to other lives, other possibilities." "What kind of possibilities?" Constance was quiet for a moment, considering. Lives where being different isn't the same as being wrong, where quiet people matter as much as loud ones, where love is about understanding, not just wanting. Jacob felt something shift in his chest at her words, a recognition that went deeper than attraction or sympathy. This woman understood things about loneliness and hoped that he'd never been able to put into words himself. "Maybe," he said carefully, "we can build that kind of life here, together." When Constance smiled at him then, really smiled for the first time since he'd known her, Jacob realized that Samuel Hartwell had made a terrible mistake. He'd thrown away something precious because he couldn't see past its quiet packaging. But Jacob was beginning to understand that the best treasures were often the ones people overlooked, like his wife, sitting in lamplight with a book in her lap and dreams in her eyes that were just beginning to unfold. The scream that cut through the October morning air sent ice through Jacob's veins as he raced toward the corral where Constance stood frozen, watching his prize bull Thunder charge directly at her. The massive animal, normally gentle as a lamb, had somehow gotten spooked and now bore down on Jacob's wife with 2,000 pounds of muscle and fury behind his charge. "Don't move!" Jacob shouted, vaulting the fence rails in one fluid motion. But Constance was already moving, not away from the bull as any sensible person would, but toward the corner where Jacob's injured mare Stella lay trapped against the fence, unable to rise on her bandaged leg. "Get back!" Jacob yelled, but Constance ignored him completely. She positioned herself between the charging bull and the helpless horse, spreading her arms wide like she thought she could stop a freight train with willpower alone. Thunder skidded to a halt just inches from her, snorting and pawing the ground, confused by this small human who refused to run. Constance stood perfectly still, speaking in low, soothing tones that Jacob couldn't quite hear over his own pounding heartbeat. "Easy, boy," she murmured, extending one hand slowly toward the agitated animal. "Nobody's going to hurt you. You're just scared, aren't you?" Jacob crept closer, moving carefully so as not to startle the bull further. He'd raised Thunder from a calf, but a spooked bull was dangerous no matter how gentle his nature. One wrong move, and Constance could be killed. "That's it," Constance continued, her voice steady as bedrock despite the obvious danger. "You remember me, don't you? I'm the one who brings you apples sometimes when Jacob's not looking." Thunder's ears flicked forward, and some of the wildness left his eyes. He stretched his massive neck toward Constance's outstretched hand, allowing her to touch his nose with fingers that Jacob now noticed were trembling slightly. "There's my good boy," she whispered, stroking the bull's forehead. "What got you so worked up?" Jacob saw then a piece of broken fence wire caught in Thunder's shoulder, the sharp metal digging deeper every time the animal moved. No wonder he'd been acting crazy. Constance, Jacob said quietly, not wanting to break the spell she'd woven over the agitated bull, can you keep him calm while I get that wire out? She nodded without taking her eyes off Thunder's face, continuing her gentle stroking and soft words. Jacob approached from the side, pulling his knife from his belt. One quick cut freed the wire, and Thunder immediately relaxed, the pain that had driven him to violence finally gone. How did you know? Jacob asked when the bull had wandered away to graze peacefully. How did you know he was hurt, and not just mean? Constance was checking on Stella, running expert hands over the mare's injured leg. Animals don't act crazy without reason, she said simply. Something was wrong, so I looked for what it might be. You could have been killed. So could Stella, Constance replied, helping the mare struggle to her feet. She's counting on us to protect her. Jacob stared at his wife with new eyes. This quiet woman, who apologized for breaking dishes, had just faced down an angry bull to save an injured horse. The courage it took was beyond anything he'd imagined her capable of. Where did you learn so much about animals? He asked. A shadow crossed Constance's face. When I was little, before Mama died, the animals were my friends. Papa's dogs, the barn cats, even the chickens. They didn't care that I was plain or quiet. They just wanted kindness. And after your mama died, Papa said I spent too much time with beasts and not enough learning proper woman's work, but I kept sneaking out to the barn anyway. Margaret would cover for me sometimes. Jacob felt another piece of the puzzle that was his wife fall into place. She'd found acceptance among creatures that couldn't judge her, developing skills and confidence that her father had tried to crush. That afternoon, while Jacob repaired the fence, he watched Constance work in the garden she'd been slowly expanding. Over the past 2 months, she'd transformed his simple vegetable patch into something approaching artistry. Neat rows of late-season crops stretched toward carefully tended herb borders, and she'd convinced Jacob to help her build raised beds for the flowers she'd always wanted to grow. Those roses are going to be beautiful come spring, Jacob said, leaning on his shovel. If they survive the winter, Constance replied, but there was satisfaction in her voice. Mrs. Patterson brought me cuttings from her grandmother's bush. Says they've been growing in this territory for 20 years. Mrs. Patterson thinks highly of you, Jacob observed. Says you're the best neighbor she's had in years. Constance blushed, but Jacob could see pleasure in her face. The older woman had become a good friend over the past weeks, stopping by regularly to share coffee and conversation. It was the first real friendship Constance had ever had with another woman. She doesn't make me feel stupid for not knowing things, Constance said. When I asked her how to preserve peaches, she just showed me. Didn't act like I should already know. Most people around here help each other learn, Jacob said. It's how we all survive. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Constance surprised Jacob by pulling out a folded piece of paper. I wrote something, she said shyly. A poem about the ranch, about us. I don't know if it's any good. I'd like to hear it, Jacob said, setting aside the harness he'd been mending. Constance unfolded the paper with nervous fingers and began to read. In morning light across the valley floor, 2 hearts learn what they're beating for. Not the love that burns like wildfire bright, but steady warmth through winter's night. She tends the garden, he mends the fence, building dreams from common sense. What started as a cruel man's jest becomes the thing they both love best. Her voice grew stronger as she read, and Jacob felt something shift in his chest. The words painted their life together with gentle beauty, finding poetry in ordinary moments. That's beautiful, he said when she finished. You should write more. You really think so? I think you've got a gift, Jacob said honestly. Your father was wrong about a lot of things, but he was especially wrong about you being worthless. Constance folded the paper carefully, but Jacob could see the glow of pride in her face. I have been thinking about writing more. Stories, maybe? About the people out here, the lives they build. I'd read every word, Jacob promised. As October faded into November, Jacob found himself looking forward to coming home each evening. Not just to hot meals and clean clothes, but to conversations that made him think, to laughter that came easier each day, to the growing sense that he and Constance were building something real together. She transformed their cabin into a true home, with small touches that spoke of care and artistry. Dried flowers hung from the rafters, releasing sweet scents when the wind stirred them. Quilts she'd sewn from fabric scraps brightened the furniture. Books lay open on tables, marking places where they'd been reading together by lamplight. "I've been thinking," Jacob said one evening as they prepared for bed, "about expanding the house come spring. Maybe adding a proper parlor, another bedroom. That would be nice." Constance agreed, then hesitated. "Jacob, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Do you think, that is, would it be all right if I invited Margaret for Christmas? I know things are strange between us now, but she's still my sister. And I think she might be lonely." The question surprised Jacob, but as he considered it, he realized it showed something important about Constance's character. Despite how her family had treated her, she still had room in her heart for forgiveness. "If that's what you want," he said, "this is your home too, Constance. You can invite anyone you please." The smile she gave him was radiant. "Thank you. I think it might help her understand that I'm happy. Really happy." Later, lying in the loft while Constance settled into sleep below, Jacob reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He'd come to the Hartwell ranch, seeking one kind of love, and found something entirely different, deeper, perhaps, and certainly more lasting. Samuel Hartwell had meant to insult them both, giving his worthless daughter to a worthless cowboy. Instead, he'd created something beautiful, two people learning to value themselves through each other's eyes. Jacob smiled into the darkness. Come spring, he'd have to thank his father-in-law for the greatest gift of his life. The gunshot echoed across the frozen valley like thunder, sending Jacob's blood ice cold as he watched three riders approach his ranch house at full gallop. Through the December wind, he could see Samuel Hartwell leading two hired guns, their faces grim with the kind of purpose that meant serious trouble. "Constance," Jacob called toward the cabin. "Get inside and stay there." But his wife was already stepping onto the porch, her face pale but determined. She'd heard the shot too, and Jacob could see in her eyes that she knew exactly what this visit meant. Her father had finally come to collect what he thought was his. "Well, well," Hartwell called out as he reined in his horse 20 feet from the porch. "Looks like married life agrees with you, daughter. You're standing straighter than I've seen in years." "Papa," Constance said quietly, her hands clasped in front of her. "What brings you here?" "Business," Hartwell replied, his pale eyes shifting to Jacob. "Seems there's been some confusion about your marriage contract, Thorne. Time to set things straight." Jacob stepped protectively in front of his wife, his hand resting on the rifle he'd grabbed from inside the cabin. "What kind of confusion?" "The kind that happens when a man doesn't read the fine print," one of the hired guns said with a nasty grin. He was a lean, dangerous-looking man with scars on his hands and the dead eyes of someone who killed for money. "Mr. Hartwell here reconsidered the terms of your deal." "There was no deal," Jacob said firmly. "I married Constance fair and square, with a preacher and witnesses." "Ah, but you see," Hartwell said, pulling a folded paper from his coat, "there's the matter of this promissory note you signed. $200 borrowed against future earnings, with my daughter as collateral." Jacob's stomach dropped. He'd been so focused on the wedding ceremony that he'd barely glanced at the papers Hartwell had made him sign. That was the dowry money. Was it? Hartwell's smile was sharp as a blade. Or was it a loan that you failed to repay? Because according to this document, if you default on payment, the collateral returns to me. "That's not legal," Constance said, stepping forward despite Jacob's attempt to shield her. "You can't use a person as collateral for a debt." "Can't I?" Hartwell's eyes glittered with malice. "You're still my daughter, girl. Still my property until your husband proves he can support you proper, like. And since he's behind on his payments." The second hired gun, a bull of a man with hands like ham hocks, spat tobacco juice into the snow. "We're here to collect what's owed, one way or another." Jacob's mind raced. He'd used the dowry money to buy additional cattle and improve the ranch, investments that would pay off come spring but left him cash poor now. Even if he sold everything he owned, he couldn't raise $200 in the middle of winter. I need time, Jacob said. Come spring, when I sell the cattle. Time's up, Hartwell interrupted. I've got a buyer for this spread, and he wants it clear of any complications. You can't pay, so the girl comes home with me. Over my dead body, Jacob said, raising his rifle. The two hired guns immediately drew their weapons, and suddenly, the peaceful ranch yard became a battlefield. Jacob knew he was outgunned, but he'd die before he let them take Constance back to the life of servitude she'd escaped. Jacob, no, Constance said urgently, placing her hand on his arm. There has to be another way. Listen to her, boy, Hartwell said. She's showing more sense than you are. Come along, Constance. Time to come home where you belong. I am home, Constance replied, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. This is where I belong. Not according to the law, the scarred gunman said. A woman belongs to her father until her husband can prove he's worthy of her, and this saddle tramp sure hasn't done that. Jacob felt rage build in his chest like a fire. These men saw Constance as property to be traded, not a human being with her own will and worth. The same anger that had driven him to fight in the saloon months ago now burned even hotter. She's not property, Jacob said through gritted teeth. She's my wife, and she stays here. Your wife? Hartwell laughed coldly. Boy, you couldn't afford a woman like Margaret, so I gave you the scraps instead. Don't pretend this was some grand romance. The words hit their mark, and Jacob saw Constance flinch as if she'd been slapped. For a moment, doubt flickered in her eyes, the old uncertainty that told her she was second best, unwanted, worth less than nothing. But then something remarkable happened. Constance straightened her shoulders and stepped forward, placing herself between the guns and her husband. You're wrong, Papa, she said, her voice carrying a strength Jacob had never heard before. Jacob didn't settle for scraps. He chose me. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He sees things in me that you never bothered to look for. Pretty words, Hartwell sneered. But they don't change facts. He can't pay his debts, which means he can't keep his wife. What if I could pay? A new voice called from behind the hired guns. Everyone turned to see Margaret riding up the valley trail, her horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. She looked magnificent in her blue cloak, her golden hair streaming behind her like a banner. Margaret, Constance gasped. What are you doing here? Stopping Papa from making the biggest mistake of his life. Margaret replied, dismounting and walking toward the tense group. I heard what you were planning, Papa. I couldn't let you do it. Hartwell's face darkened. This is none of your concern, girl. Isn't it? Margaret pulled a leather pouch from her saddlebag, coins jingling inside. $200, Papa. Payment in full for Jacob's debt. Where did you get that money? Hartwell demanded. Mama's inheritance, Margaret said calmly. The money you've been keeping safe for me until I married. Well, I'm using it now, for something that actually matters. Jacob stared at Margaret in amazement. Why would you do this? Margaret looked at her sister, with eyes full of regret and love. Because I've been watching you two these past months. I've seen how happy Constance is, how she glows when she talks about her life here. I've never seen her like that before, confident, valued, loved. She turned to face her father, her voice gaining strength. And I've seen what kind of man Jacob really is. Not the worthless drifter you called him, but someone who sees worth where others see only problems. Someone who chose love over beauty, substance over surface. Hartwell's face was purple with rage. You foolish girl. That money was meant to secure your future. No, Papa, Margaret said firmly. That money was meant to buy me a husband who would value your wealth more than me. But I'd rather be poor and loved than rich and treated like a prize cow. The hired guns looked uncertain now, their clear-cut mission complicated by family drama they hadn't signed up for. The scarred one holstered his weapon. Mr. Hartwell, if the debt's paid. Take the money, Hartwell snarled, snatching the pouch from Margaret's hands. But don't think this changes anything. You're still my daughters, both of you, and I won't forget this betrayal. We're not your daughters anymore, Papa, Constance said quietly. We're women who've learned to choose our own paths. You can't control us with fear and cruelty anymore." Hartwell's eyes blazed with fury, but he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The debt was paid, the legal grounds for his claim were gone, and even his hired guns were looking uncomfortable with the situation. "This isn't over," he warned, wheeling his horse around. "Mark my words, you'll all regret this day." As the three men rode away, Jacob lowered his rifle with shaking hands. The confrontation had lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. More importantly, it had changed everything. "Margaret," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me," Margaret replied, embracing her sister. "Thank Constance. She's the one who showed me what real courage looks like." The two sisters held each other tight, and Jacob saw tears on both their faces, not of sadness, but of relief and newfound understanding. "I was so jealous," Margaret whispered. "Jealous that you found something real, while I was still waiting for someone to see past my pretty face to whatever might be underneath." "You'll find it," Constance said firmly. "Someone who loves you for who you are, not what you look like." As the sisters talked, Jacob found himself thinking about the strange turns of fate. Samuel Hartwell's cruelty had backfired completely. His attempt to humiliate Jacob and dispose of Constance had instead created a bond stronger than any he could have imagined. And now even Margaret had found the courage to stand up to their father's tyranny. The man who'd thought he was giving away worthless scraps had actually been handing out the most precious gifts of a love, courage, and the chance for his daughters to discover their own worth. The January blizzard had been howling for 3 days straight, trapping Jacob, Constance, and Margaret inside the cabin with nothing but each other's company and the slowly dwindling supply of firewood. But it was the fever that had Jacob truly scared. Constance lay delirious in their bed, burning hot 1 minute and shivering the next, while he felt completely helpless to save the woman who'd become his whole world. "Her breathing's getting worse," Margaret said from beside the bed, her usual beauty replaced by the haggard look of someone who'd been nursing a patient for days without sleep. Jacob pressed his hand to Constance's forehead, feeling the dangerous heat radiating from her skin. "We need to get her to the doctor in town, but with this storm, we'd never make it," Margaret finished. "The drifts are 10 feet high in places." Outside, the wind screamed like a living thing, shaking the cabin walls and sending snow through every crack. Jacob had reinforced the windows with quilts, but cold air still seeped in, making their struggle to keep Constance warm even harder. "Tell me about the medicine chest," Margaret said, moving to the cabinet where Jacob kept his supplies. "What do we have?" Jacob joined her, pulling bottles and packets from the shelves. Willow bark tea for fever, honey for cough, some laudanum for pain. "Mrs. Patterson gave me some herbs last fall, but I don't know what half of them are for." Margaret picked up a small cloth bag and sniffed it. "This is elderberry. Mama used to make tea from it when we were sick. And this." She held up another packet. "Echinacea root. The Indian women at the trading post swear by it for lung troubles." "You know about medicine?" Jacob asked, surprised. "Some," Margaret admitted. "I used to help Mama when she tended sick folks before she died. Papa made me stop after the funeral, said it wasn't fitting for a lady to mess with such things." Jacob felt a familiar anger at Samuel Hartwell's narrow-mindedness. How many useful skills had he forbidden his daughters to develop? How much knowledge had been wasted because he thought women should be decorative rather than capable? "What would your mama have done?" Jacob asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment, thinking, steam tent first, to help her breathe, then the elderberry tea to fight the fever. And she hesitated. She'd have used mustard plasters on the chest, but they can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. "Show me," Jacob said without hesitation. They worked together through the night, taking turns sitting with Constance while the other prepared medicines or tended the fire. Margaret proved to be a skilled nurse, gentle but efficient, with an intuitive understanding of what needed to be done. "I never realized how much I missed this," Margaret said as they prepared another pot of elderberry tea. "Taking care of people, feeling useful for something besides looking pretty." "Why did you stop?" Jacob asked. "Because Papa said it made me smell like a servant," Margaret replied bitterly. "Said men wanted wives who were ornamental, not practical. I believed him for so long that I forgot I actually enjoyed helping people. Around dawn, Constance's fever finally broke. She opened her eyes, weak but lucid, and managed a small smile when she saw Jacob's worried face. "You look terrible," she whispered, her voice hoarse from coughing. "You're one to talk," Jacob replied, relief making his voice shake. "You scared me half to death." "Margaret?" Constance noticed her sister dozing in a chair beside the bed. "What's she doing here?" "Saving your life," Jacob said simply. "She knew things about medicine that I didn't. If she hadn't been here." He couldn't finish the sentence, but Constance understood. She reached out and touched Margaret's hand, waking her sister gently. "Thank you," Constance said. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I should have learned more from Mama. Should have paid better attention instead of worrying about my hair and dresses." "You remembered what mattered when it counted," Constance replied. "That's what love does. It helps us find strength we didn't know we had." The storm finally broke on the fourth day, leaving the world buried under pristine white snow that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. Jacob dug a path to the barn to check on the animals, grateful to find that his preparations had kept them safe through the worst weather he'd seen in years. When he returned to the cabin, he found the sisters sitting together by the fire, talking quietly. There was something different about Margareta, seriousness that hadn't been there before, as if the crisis had stripped away the pretty girl to reveal the capable woman underneath. "I've been thinking," Margaret said when Jacob joined them, "about what I want to do with my life." "What do you mean?" Jacob asked. "I mean, I'm 21 years old, and I've never done anything useful with my time. I've been waiting for a husband to give my life meaning, but watching you two," she gestured between Jacob and Constance, "you built something meaningful together. You're partners, not just pretty decorations for each other's lives." Constance squeezed her sister's hand. "You'll find someone who appreciates all of you, not just your beauty." "Maybe," Margaret said. "But first, I need to figure out who I really am, when I'm not trying to be what Papa thinks men want." Over the following weeks, as Constance recovered her strength, Margaret proved to be a revelation. She threw herself into ranch work with enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including herself. She learned to milk cows, gather eggs, and help with the cooking. More importantly, she began riding out to neighboring ranches to offer nursing services to anyone who needed them. "Mrs. Patterson says I have real talent for healing," Margaret told them one evening, glowing with pride. "She's teaching me about different herbs and how to prepare them." "That's wonderful," Constance said, and Jacob could hear the genuine happiness in her voice. There was no jealousy, no resentment that her beautiful sister was finding another way to shine. Just pure joy at seeing Margaret discover her own worth. "I was thinking," Margaret continued, "about staying in the territory instead of going back to Papa's house, maybe setting up as a proper nurse, helping families who can't get to town when someone's sick." "You'd be welcome to stay here as long as you want," Jacob offered. "We could add another room to the cabin come spring." "That's kind of you," Margaret said, "but I think I need to make my own way for a while, prove to myself that I can be independent." Jacob admired her courage. It took real strength to choose an uncertain future over the security of her father's house, especially for a woman who'd been raised to believe her only value lay in her ability to attract a wealthy husband. "There's a widow woman in town, Mrs. Cooper, who might rent you a room," Constance suggested. "She's been talking about wanting a companion since her husband died." "I'll talk to her next time I'm in town," Margaret said. "Thank you both for everything, for showing me what a real marriage looks like, what real love can be." That night, as Jacob and Constance prepared for bed, she brought up something that had been on her mind. "Do you think we'll have children someday?" she asked quietly. The question caught Jacob off guard. They'd been married for months, but their relationship had developed so gradually that they'd never discussed their future in specific terms. "Do you want children?" he asked. "I think so," Constance said. "I'd like to raise them different than Papa raised us. Teach them that their worth doesn't depend on what other people think." "I'd like that too," Jacob said, pulling her close. "Children who know they're loved for who they are, not what they look like or how much money they bring to the family." As they held each other in the warm darkness, Jacob reflected on how much his life had changed since that fateful day at the Hartwell ranch. He'd thought he was settling for second best, accepting damaged goods because he couldn't have what he really wanted. Instead, he'd found something infinitely more valuably: a partnership built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the kind of love that grew stronger with each passing day. Samuel Hartwell's cruel gesture had backfired completely, giving Jacob the greatest gift of his life disguised as an insult. And now Margaret was finding her own path to independence and self-worth, proving that the Hartwell daughters were far more valuable than their father had ever realized. The man who'd treated his children as burdens to be disposed of had actually raised two remarkable women who just needed someone to believe in them. Outside, the wind whispered through the valley that had become their sanctuary, carrying promises of spring and new beginnings. In the warmth of their small cabin, surrounded by the life they'd built from nothing but determination and unexpected love, Jacob finally understood that sometimes the greatest prayers are answered not with what we think we want, but with what we never knew we needed. The flames reached toward the April sky like desperate fingers, consuming Jacob's barn in a roar of heat and smoke that could be seen for miles across the Wyoming territory. He stood helpless with a bucket in his hands, watching 3 years of hard work turn to ash while his cattle scattered in terror across the valley. "The house!" Constance screamed from behind him. "Jacob, the sparks are blowing toward the house!" He spun around to see embers dancing on the wind like deadly fireflies, several already landing on their cabin's wooden roof. Everything they'd built together, their home, their dreams, their carefully planned future, hung in the balance of the next few minutes. "Get the wet blankets," Jacob shouted, already running toward the cabin with his water bucket. "Margaret, help me get on the roof." Margaret appeared with an armload of soaked quilts, her face streaked with soot but determined. The three of them worked frantically, beating out small fires before they could spread, while behind them the barn collapsed in on itself with a sound like thunder. "How did this start?" Margaret called over the crackling flames. "Don't know," Jacob replied, climbing down from the roof as the immediate danger passed. "I checked everything this morning. No lanterns left burning. Hay wasn't damp enough to catch from heat." A horse's whinny made them all turn toward the valley road, where a rider approached at full gallop. Jacob's blood went cold when he recognized Tom Bradley, one of Samuel Hartwell's most trusted ranch hands. "Well, well," Bradley called out as he reined in his horse just outside the fire's glow. "Looks like you folks have had some bad luck." "Tom," Jacob said carefully, noting how the man's eyes held no surprise at the destruction before him, "what brings you out here?" "Boss sent me to check on his daughters," Bradley replied with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Make sure they're safe and all. Terrible thing, fires. So hard to predict when they might happen." The implication hit Jacob like a physical blow. Samuel Hartwell had done this, sent someone to burn them out when legal pressure had failed to drive them apart. "You did this," Constance said, her voice shaking with rage. "Papa sent you to burn our barn." "Now, that's a serious accusation," Bradley said, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Can't prove something like that. Accidents happen all the time on ranches, especially to folks who don't know their place." Margaret stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "I know Papa's methods, Tom. This has his fingerprints all over it." "Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't," Bradley shrugged. "Point is, message is delivered. Some folks might want to think about moving on before more accidents happen." "Get off my land," Jacob said, his voice deadly quiet. "Or what?" Bradley's grin widened. "You'll shoot an unarmed man? That'd be murder, Thorne. Even out here, law still matters." Jacob's hand moved toward his rifle, but Constance caught his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "That's what they want. Give them an excuse to call the sheriff." Bradley laughed. "Smart woman. Maybe she can talk some sense into you, Thorne. This territory's getting crowded. Room for the strong, not so much for the weak." As the rider disappeared back down the valley, Jacob surveyed the smoking ruins of his barn. 3 years of savings, gone in one night. His farming equipment, winter hay, feed for the cattle all destroyed. Even if they could rebuild, winter was still months away, and they'd be starting from nothing. We can't stay here, Jacob said finally, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. Yes, we can, Constance replied firmly. This is our home, Jacob. We don't run from bullies. Look around, Jacob gestured at the destruction. How are we supposed to survive without the barn? Without equipment or feed for the animals? The same way we survived everything else, Constance said, taking his hand. Together, one day at a time. Margaret nodded in agreement. And you're not alone. Half the territory owes Papa money or favors, but the other half can't stand him. There are people who'll help if we ask. Over the next week, Margaret's prediction proved prophetic. News of the suspicious fire spread quickly through the scattered ranching community, and neighbors began arriving with offers of help. Mrs. Patterson brought lumber from her husband's sawmill. The Martinez family contributed nails and tools. Even old Pete from the saloon in Dusty Creek showed up, with a wagon full of supplies. Heard you had some trouble, Pete said, unloading sacks of grain. Man can't let his neighbors go hungry, especially when there's rats trying to drive out decent folks. I can't pay you back right away, Jacob said, overwhelmed by the generosity. Didn't ask you to, Pete replied. Community takes care of its own. Hartwell may have money, but he's got no friends. You do. As they worked to clear the burned debris and plan for rebuilding, Jacob began to understand something important. Samuel Hartwell's attack had backfired, just like all his previous schemes. Instead of isolating Jacob and Constance, it had revealed how much respect they'd earned in the community. People see you as one of them now, Margaret explained as they sorted through donated materials. You're not the outsider Papa tried to make you think you were. You're the neighbor who helps when there's trouble, the man who treats his wife with respect, the couple who makes everyone believe in good things. But it was Constance who surprised Jacob most during the rebuilding. The quiet woman who'd once apologized for breaking dishes now organized work crews with the efficiency of a general planning a campaign. She coordinated food for the volunteers, negotiated trades for materials they couldn't afford, and somehow managed to keep everyone's spirits up despite the enormity of the task ahead. Where did this come from? Jacob asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the frame of the new barn take shape. What do you mean? This? Jacob gestured toward the construction site where lanterns burned as men worked into the night. The way you're managing everything, I never knew you had it in you. Constance was quiet for a moment. I guess I never knew either. At Papa's house, I was just supposed to stay quiet and not cause trouble. But this is our home, our life. It's worth fighting for. You're not the same woman I married, Jacob observed. Neither are you, Constance replied with a smile. The Jacob I married would have given up by now, packed up and moved on rather than fight back. She was right, Jacob realized. The man who'd come begging to Samuel Hartwell for Margaret's hand would have been broken by this setback. But something had changed in him over the months of marriage to Constance. Her quiet strength had become his foundation. Her belief in their partnership had given him courage he'd never possessed alone. We're different people than we were, Jacob said wonderingly. Better people, Constance agreed. Papa thought he was punishing us, but he gave us exactly what we needed each other, and the chance to become who we were meant to be. A month later, the new barn stood completed, larger and better built than its predecessor. The community celebration that marked its raising drew families from 50 miles around, turning into an impromptu festival that lasted well into the night. Look at them, Margaret said, watching Jacob and Constance dance to fiddle music under the stars. They're so happy it hurts to watch sometimes. Jealous? Asked Dr. Harrison, the young physician who'd recently arrived in the territory and had been paying increasing attention to Margaret during her nursing work. Not jealous, Margaret replied thoughtfully. Grateful. They showed me what real love looks like, what a real partnership can be. I know what to look for now. And what's that? Dr. Harrison asked, moving closer in the lantern light. Someone who sees me for who I really am, Margaret said, meeting his eyes directly. Not just a pretty face, but a person with thoughts and dreams and skills worth respecting. I see all of that, Dr. Harrison said quietly. Have from the first day we met. As the evening wound down and neighbors began heading home, Jacob found himself standing with Constance beside the new barn, watching the last of the celebration. Your father made another mistake, Jacob said, pulling his wife close. How so? He thought destroying the barn would break us. Instead, it proved how strong we really are. Not just us, but our whole community. He's alone in his big house with his money and his hatred, and we're surrounded by people who care about us. Constance leaned against his shoulder, watching Margaret and Dr. Glenn. Harrison talked quietly by the dying fire. Margaret's going to be all right too. She's found her purpose, and maybe found someone who appreciates it. What about your father? Jacob asked. Think he'll try again? Probably, Constance said without fear. But it doesn't matter anymore. He can't hurt us, Jacob. We're too strong now, too connected to good people. Whatever he throws at us, we'll handle it together. Standing there in the warm spring night, surrounded by the evidence of their community's support and their own resilience, Jacob finally understood what Constance had been trying to tell him. They weren't just surviving Samuel Hartwell's cruelty, they were thriving because of it. The man who'd meant to destroy them had instead forged them into something unbreakable, and that, Jacob thought with deep satisfaction, was probably the sweetest revenge of all. The town meeting erupted into chaos the moment Samuel Hartwell stood to speak. His voice cutting through the humid August air like a blade, as he pointed an accusing finger at Jacob and Constance in the back of the crowded schoolhouse. Every person in Dusty Creek seemed to be crammed into the small building, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. These people are a danger to our community, Hartwell declared, his face red with righteous anger. Jacob Thorne came here with nothing, married my daughter under false pretenses, and has been stirring up trouble ever since. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others looking skeptical. Jacob felt Constance's hand slip into his, her fingers steady despite the attack on their character. That's a serious charge, Mr. Hartwell, said Mayor Collins, a fair-minded man who'd known the territory for 20 years. What evidence do you have? Hartwell pulled out a folder thick with papers, debt records showing he borrowed money he couldn't repay, witness statements about his violent behavior in saloons. And most damning of all, proof that he's been organizing resistance against established ranchers who've built this community. Jacob started to stand, but Dr. Harrison, who was sitting near the front with Margaret, beat him to it. I object to these proceedings, the young doctor said firmly. Mr. Hartwell is making accusations without allowing the accused to defend themselves. This isn't a court of law, it's a lynching party. Sit down, boy, growled Bill Monroe, one of Hartwell's cronies. This is grown-up business. Actually, came a voice from the middle of the room. The doctor's right. Mrs. Patterson stood up, her gray hair pinned severely, but her eyes blazing with determination. I've lived in this territory longer than almost anyone here, and I've never seen such a shameful display of character assassination. Martha's right, called out Pete from the saloon. Jacob Thorne's as honest as the day is long, pays his debts, helps his neighbors, treats his wife like a queen, more than I can say for some folks. The crowd began to divide visibly, those who'd experienced Hartwell's bullying tactics on one side, those who benefited from his wealth and influence on the other. Jacob could see friends and neighbors choosing sides, the community splitting apart along lines that might never heal. Enough. Mayor Collins banged his gavel repeatedly. Everyone will have a chance to speak, but we'll do this orderly. Like, Mr. Hartwell, you called this meeting. Present your evidence. What followed was a systematic attempt to destroy Jacob's reputation. Hartwell had indeed done his homework, producing witnesses who testified to Jacob's violent temper and unreliable character. Some of the testimony was twisted truth, the saloon fight presented as evidence of dangerous instability rather than justified anger. Some was outright lies, purchased with Hartwell's money from men desperate enough to sell their honesty. He's a troublemaker, testified one of Hartwell's ranch hands, always talking about how the big ranchers take advantage of the little folks, trying to organize some kind of rebellion. Jacob felt the noose tightening around his neck with each false word. In a small community like this, reputation was everything. Without it, he and Constance would be outcasts, unable to buy supplies, hire help, or maintain the friendships that had sustained them through every crisis. Mr. Thorne, Mayor Collins said finally, you'll have your chance to respond to these charges. Jacob stood slowly, acutely aware of every eye in the room. This was the moment that would define not just his future, but Constance's as well. Whatever he said next would either save them or damn them both. "I'm not much for fancy speeches," Jacob began, his voice steady despite the stakes. "So I'll just tell you the truth, plain and simple." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of people who'd become his neighbors and friends over the past year. "Samuel Hartwell says I came here with nothing, and he's right. I was a cowboy with 40 acres and a dream of something better. He says I married his daughter under false pretenses, and maybe that's partly true too. I went to his ranch asking for Margaret's hand, thinking that was what I wanted." A stir went through the crowd at this admission. Jacob saw Margaret flush, but nod encouragingly. "But Samuel Hartwell made me the greatest gift of my life when he gave me Constance instead. Not because he was being generous, meant it as an insult, a way to get rid of what he saw as worthless goods. But he was wrong about his daughter's worth, just like he's wrong about most things." Jacob's voice grew stronger as he continued. "You want to know what kind of man I really am? Ask Pete here, who helped rebuild his saloon after the fire 2 years ago. Ask the Martinez family, who brought in their harvest when old Carlos hurt his back. Ask any of a dozen families who've eaten at my table or found shelter in my barn when they needed help." "That's different," Monroe interrupted. "That's just being neighborly." "Is it?" Jacob challenged. "Because Mr. Hartwell there has never lifted a finger to help anyone unless there was profit in it for him. When the widow Morrison was about to lose her farm, did he offer assistance? When the Fletcher children were sick and their father couldn't afford medicine, where was his Christian charity?" The room grew quieter as people began to remember incidents they'd tried to forget, times when Hartwell's wealth could have eased suffering but hadn't. "You want to know about debt?" Jacob continued, pulling papers from his own pocket. "Here's every penny I've borrowed and every penny I've paid back, with interest. My books are open to anyone who wants to look. Can Samuel Hartwell say the same?" This struck home. Everyone knew Hartwell kept his business dealings secret, using lawyers and complicated contracts to hide his methods. And as for being a troublemaker, Jacob's voice rose with passion. "I plead guilty to that charge. I do think the big ranchers take advantage of small folks. I do think working people deserve fair wages and honest treatment. If that makes me dangerous, then I'm proud to be dangerous." The applause started slowly, with Pete and Mrs. Patterson clapping loudly from their seats. But it spread quickly through the room, as people remembered who had helped them in times of need, who had treated them with respect, regardless of their social standing. Then Constance stood up. The room fell silent immediately. Everyone knew how rare it was for her to speak in public, how she usually stayed in the background and let others do the talking. When she did speak, her voice was quiet but clear, carrying easily through the hushed schoolhouse. "Mr. Hartwell is my father," she said simply. "I've lived with his version of the truth my whole life. He told me I was plain, worthless, a burden he had to bear. He told me no man would ever want me for myself. He told me I should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection anyone threw my way." She paused, and Jacob could see tears in her eyes, but her voice never wavered. "Then I married Jacob Thorne, and I learned that everything my father told me was a lie. I learned that I have worth beyond what others see on the surface. I learned that quiet strength is as valuable as loud confidence. I learned that love isn't about settling for what you can get. It's about recognizing what you already have." The room was so quiet that Jacob could hear the wind rustling the trees outside the schoolhouse. "My father gave me to Jacob as a cruel joke," Constance continued. "He thought he was insulting us both. Instead, he gave us the chance to build something beautiful together. We're not perfect, but we're honest. We're not rich, but we're generous. We're not powerful, but we stand up for what's right." She looked directly at her father, for the first time since the meeting began. "You taught me to be ashamed of who I am, Papa, but Jacob taught me to be proud of who I'm becoming. That's the difference between you and him, and that's why your lies can't touch us anymore." The silence that followed was profound. Even Hartwell's supporters seemed stunned by the quiet dignity of Constance's words, the simple truth that cut through all the complicated accusations and countercharges. Finally, Mayor Collins spoke. I think we've heard enough testimony for one evening. This matter will be put to a community vote next week. Everyone eligible will have their say about whether the Thornes should remain welcome in Dusty Creek. As the crowd began to disperse, Jacob felt a mixture of pride and terror. Constance had been magnificent, transforming from the scared girl he'd married into a woman of remarkable courage and eloquence. But the battle wasn't over yet. Whatever happens, he whispered to her as they walked toward their wagon, I'm proud to be your husband. And I'm proud to be your wife, she replied, squeezing his hand. We'll face whatever comes together. Behind them, Samuel Hartwell watched his daughters walk away with the men who'd had the audacity to defy him. His face was a mask of rage and frustration, but underneath Jacob caught a glimpse of something else, the dawning realization that his greatest weapons, fear and shame, no longer had any power over the people he'd tried to destroy. The war wasn't over, but the tide had definitely turned.